The city skyline dissolved into gray static behind the floor-to-ceiling glass. I had rehearsed the words all morning, but now, standing before her mahogany desk, they tasted like ash. Can I work remotely next week? The question hung in the air, fragile and exposed. Emily didn't look up immediately. Her pen continued its rhythmic scratch against the contract, measuring the silence. Finally, it stopped. She raised her head, her gaze dark and unflinching. "No," she said, her voice a low, smooth command. "I need you here, in my penthouse office." The Aura launch was days away, and my bid for distance had backfired into a mandate for absolute proximity. Working at Sterling & Vance wasn't just a job. It was an exercise in survival within a finely tuned ecosystem of high stakes and expensive silence. The firm operated on a frequency that most people couldn't hear until it shattered them. It was a world of sharp lines, chrome accents, and air conditioned to a temperature that kept you awake and on edge. At the center of this orbit stood Emily. She didn't just run the company, she was its gravity. Her reputation preceded her like a weather front, a woman of terrifying precision who could dismantle a competitor's strategy with a whisper and dominate a boardroom without raising her voice. She moved through the corridors with a lethal grace, her heels clicking a rhythm that made senior partners straighten their ties and junior analysts stare at the floor. I was the latter, a junior analyst, barely 3 months into a tenure that felt like a trial by fire. I was competent. My data modeling was flawless, my projections airtight. But competence felt like a flimsy shield when faced with the sheer force of Emily's presence. The Aura launch wasn't merely a product release. It was the pivot point for the firm's next decade, a sophisticated AI integration that promised to redefine market prediction. The pressure in the office was palpable, a physical weight that pressed against your chest the moment the elevator doors slid open. Everyone was running on caffeine and adrenaline, terrified of making a mistake that would draw Emily's cool, dissecting attention. But my terror was different. It wasn't the work that made my hands shake when I handed her a file. It wasn't the fear of failure that made my breath catch when she leaned over my shoulder to point at a screen. It was the pull. An undeniable, magnetic drag that seemed to center itself right behind my ribs whenever she was near. I had asked for remote work not because I wanted to escape the grind, but because I needed to escape the distraction. Every time she spoke, every time the scent of her sandalwood and rain perfume drifted across the desk, I lost the ability to think in straight lines. I needed distance to regain my professional equilibrium. I needed a screen between us, a digital buffer to filter out the heat that rose in my cheeks whenever her eyes lingered a second too long. The vulnerability was too raw, the stakes too high to be compromised by a crush that felt increasingly like a liability. Instead, I got the itinerary. It landed on my desk an hour after our meeting, a sleek black folder that felt heavy with implication. I opened it, my fingers tracing the schedule Emily's executive assistant had prepared. It wasn't just a business trip. It was a total immersion. Private transport. A schedule that started at 6 in the morning and ended well past midnight. And the accommodation. A single booking code for the Penthouse suite at the launch venue. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just working late. This was living in her pocket for a week. The document detailed every movement, every meeting, binding my time to hers with clinical efficiency. I looked up across the open plan office toward her glass-walled sanctuary. Emily was on a call, her back to me, looking out at the city she seemed to own. She turned, as if sensing the weight of my gaze, and for a brief, electric moment, we locked eyes through the glass. She didn't smile, she didn't wave, she just watched me, her expression unreadable, acknowledging that she had pulled the string, and I was now bound to follow. The realization settled over me, heavy and absolute. There would be no buffer, no screen, no escape. The Aura launch demanded perfection, and Emily demanded me. The folder snapped shut in my hands, the sound final. The architecture of her control was complete, and as I packed my bag that evening, I knew I wasn't just packing for a business trip. I was preparing to walk directly into the fire I had been trying so desperately to avoid. The car would be downstairs in 10 minutes, waiting to carry me into the storm. The black sedan waited at the curb. Entering it felt less like getting into a car and more like being sealed into a vault. The city noise vanished the instant the heavy door thudded shut. We were insulated now, cut off from the common world, moving through traffic in a bubble of leather-scented silence. Emily didn't speak. She tapped away on her phone, the blue light reflecting off her sunglasses, already miles ahead of me in a time zone I couldn't yet see. The private terminal was a study in minimalism and exclusion. No security lines, just a nod from a concierge and a direct path to the tarmac. The jet sat waiting, silver and predatory, against the overcast sky. Steps were lowered, engines whined. I followed her up, feeling the distinct shift in atmosphere. This was the architecture of her life. Frictionless, expensive, and isolating. Inside, the cabin was smaller than I expected, forcing an intimacy that made the hair on my arms stand up. Cream leather seats faced each other, separated only by a narrow table that seemed to shrink the longer we sat there. I took my seat, and my knees were suddenly dangerously close to hers. There was nowhere to look but at her. The air was cool, recycled, and smelled faintly of ozone and expensive upholstery. "Let's review the Aura rollout," Emily said. It wasn't a suggestion. She didn't ask for a drink or settle in. She pulled a tablet from her bag and laid it on the table between us. Her voice was low, steady, a frequency designed to command absolute attention. I opened my laptop, desperate for a shield. "I've updated the user acquisition models based on the beta feedback," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet cabin. I tried to focus on the data, but the physical reality of her was overwhelming. She leaned forward to scrutinize a graph, and the movement sent a wave of her perfume across the small space. It was sandalwood and rain, complex, layered, and maddeningly distracting. It smelled like a storm waiting to break. I found myself staring at her hands as she pointed to a variance in the projection. Her fingers were long, manicured to a lethal point, moving with a deliberation that made my own hands feel clumsy. "This margin," she murmured, tapping the screen. "It's too conservative. We need to push the narrative of indispensability." I opened my mouth to defend the numbers, but the plane suddenly banked hard. The air around us turned violent. A pocket of turbulence dropped the cabin 10 feet in a heartbeat. My stomach lurched into my throat, and I gasped, my hand flying out to grip the armrest. Warmth covered my cold skin. Emily's hand was over mine. It wasn't a flinch, it was a capture. Her grip was firm, grounding, anchoring me to the seat when gravity seemed to have given up. The plane shuddered again, then leveled out, but she didn't let go. The vibration of the engines hummed through the frame of the seat, through her hand, into mine. I looked up, breath caught in my chest. She was watching me, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes tracking the fear in mine. "Steady," she said softly. She didn't move her hand. The turbulence had passed, the danger was gone, but her fingers remained laced over my knuckles. The contact was electric, a live wire running straight up my arm. It lasted a second, then two, long enough to stop being reassurance and start being something possessive. She withdrew slowly, the friction of her palm against mine leaving a phantom heat that burned. She sat back, smoothing her blazer, her composure impenetrable. But the air between us had shifted. It was charged now, thick with the static of what had just happened. "The schedule requires late nights," she said, her voice dropping back to that professional register, though her eyes held a glint of something sharper. "I need you fully immersed. No distractions." The way she said distractions felt like she was reading my mind. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The descent began before I could recover. The pressure built in my ears as the city rose up to meet us. When the door opened, the climate-controlled seal broke. Tropical heat rushed into the cabin, clinging to our skin instantly. We stepped out onto the stairs, leaving the cool, controlled air behind, descending into the sweltering reality of the launch. The hotel rose from the pavement like a monolith of obsidian and steel, a structure designed not for rest, but for the projection of power. It sliced through the humid tropical air, standing apart from the city's chaotic sprawl with a cold, detached elegance. Entering the lobby felt less like checking into a hotel and more like crossing a border into a sovereign state of wealth. The air was perfumed with white tea and silence, the kind of hushed atmosphere that usually costs a fortune to maintain. When we approached the reception, the clerk didn't ask for a credit card or identification. She simply nodded at Emily with a recognition that bordered on reverence and slid a single, heavy, slate-gray keycard across the marble counter. I waited for mine, but the clerk's hands returned to her keyboard. I looked at Emily, confusion knitting my brow, but she was already moving toward the private elevator bank, her heels clicking a rhythm that demanded I follow. The elevator ride was a rapid, silent ascent that made my ears pop, sealing us further away from the world below. When the doors slid open, there was no hallway. There was only the foyer of the penthouse suite. I stepped out, my suitcase wheels sinking into plush carpet that seemed to swallow the sound. The space was vast, a cavern of floor-to-ceiling glass and modern Italian furniture, suspended 40 stories above the harbor. It was breathtaking, but as I scanned the layout, the air in my lungs turned solid. To the left, a massive master bedroom. To the right, another, identical in scale. Between them lay the shared living space, an open-concept arena of velvet sofas and abstract art. The doors to both bedrooms stood slightly ajar. "This is," I started, my voice faltering as the reality of the arrangement settled over me. This wasn't just staying on the same floor. This was cohabitation. Emily walked past me, tossing her clutch onto a low limestone table. She moved through the space with the terrifying ease of someone who considers the entire world her living room. She walked to the wet bar, the crystal decanter catching the late afternoon sun that spilled through the western windows. "Efficient," she finished for me, though that wasn't the word I would have chosen. "We have 72 hours to finalize the launch narrative. I don't intend to waste time waiting for elevators or coordinating schedules." She poured water into a heavy tumbler. The sound of the liquid hitting the ice was sharp, cracking through the quiet room like a gunshot. She took a sip, her eyes finding mine over the rim of the glass. There was a challenge there, silent and unflinching. She was daring me to object, daring me to point out the intimacy of the setup, knowing that to do so would be to admit that I was affected by it. "Your room is the East Suite," she said, gesturing with the glass. "I'll take the West. We reconvene here in 20 minutes for the dinner prep." I nodded, gripping the handle of my luggage until my knuckles turned white, and retreated into the East Suite. I closed the door, but I didn't lock it. Locking it would have felt like an accusation. The room was a masterpiece of sensory manipulation. The walls were upholstered in a dove-gray silk that begged to be touched. The bed was an island of white linen, vast and imposing. I walked to the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to flicker on in the twilight below. The view was commanding, offering the illusion of control, but I felt entirely exposed. I began to unpack, the slide of my zippers sounding unnaturally loud. I hung my tailored blazer next to the empty hangers, my movements mechanical. But even as I organized my things, my attention was anchored elsewhere. The wall separating our rooms was thick, built for privacy, yet it felt porous. I could feel her on the other side. It was a humming frequency, a vibration in the air that bypassed my ears and registered directly in my nervous system. I heard the faint, muffled thud of her suitcase hitting the rack, the sound of water running in her bathroom. Every small noise was a reminder of her proximity. She wasn't just my boss in this space. She was a physical reality, a presence that occupied the air I was trying to breathe. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the connecting door I had pulled shut. It was just wood and paint, but it felt charged, as if the air gap between us had been electrified. I wasn't just working in her office anymore. I was living in her atmosphere, and the oxygen was already getting thin. The welcome dinner was a sea of industry titans, the air thick with ambition and the sharp, brittle clink of crystal. It was a room where net worth was the only language spoken fluently, and silence was a sign of weakness. Emily released me the moment we entered, drifting into the crowd with the ease of a predator entering familiar waters. I watched her from the edge of the terrace. She was radiant, terrifyingly so, holding court with 3 CEOs and a senator, her laughter a calculated instrument that drew them in while keeping them at arm's length. She wore her authority like armor, gleaming and impenetrable under the chandeliers. I was trying to make myself invisible against a marble pillar when a voice cut through the ambient noise. "She's wearing you out already, isn't she?" I turned. It was Julianne. I recognized her instantly. Formerly a senior partner at Sterling & Vance, now the head of a rival firm that had tried and failed to acquire us last year. She was older than Emily, with silver-streaked hair cut into a sharp bob and eyes that seemed to have seen every balance sheet in the room. She wasn't looking at me with hostility. She was observing me with the amused intelligence of someone watching a play they've seen before. "I'm fine," I lied, straightening my spine against the cool stone. "Just pacing myself. It's a long week." Julianne swirled the olive in her martini, stepping closer. The scent of her perfume was dry and herbal, a stark contrast to Emily's storm-heavy fragrance. "I'm not talking about the work, darling. I'm talking about the weather." She gestured vaguely between me and where Emily stood across the room. "The atmospheric pressure drops about 10 millibars whenever you two stand within 5 feet of each other. The static is ruining my reception." My face heated, a flush rising from my neck. "I don't know what you mean. We have a professional dynamic." "Of course you do." Julianne leaned back against the railing, the city skyline glittering behind her like a spilled jewelry box. "Emily is a force of nature. Most people try to build shelters to survive her. They hide, they agree, they make themselves small to avoid the wind. She bores them." She took a slow, deliberate sip of her drink. "But she doesn't respect shelters. She dismantles them just to see what's inside." I looked back at Emily. She was nodding at something the senator said, but her posture was rigid, her hand gripping her wineglass tight. "She doesn't want a subordinate," Julianne continued, her voice dropping, becoming a conspiratorial murmur that felt like a secret being passed in the dark. "She keeps people at a distance because she's waiting for someone who doesn't need to be kept there. True power in a partnership, business or otherwise, isn't about who gives the orders. It's the precision of knowing when to yield." She looked at me, her gaze piercing. "Yielding isn't submission, Clara. It isn't weakness. It's opening the door so the other person can finally walk through without breaking it down. Emily doesn't know how to ask for that door to be opened. She needs someone brave enough to leave it unlocked." The words settled in my chest, heavy and resonant. I looked across the sea of black ties and cocktail dresses. As if she felt the shift in my attention, Emily stopped mid-sentence. She turned, ignoring the senator, ignoring the room. Her eyes found mine in the shadows of the terrace. She didn't look away. Across 50 feet of crowded ballroom, the connection was immediate and physical. A taut line pulled tight between us. She wasn't looking at her assistant. She was looking for her anchor. For a moment, the noise of the party faded into a dull roar, and it was just us, suspended in the tension. Her gaze was a question I was only just learning how to answer. Julianne chuckled softly beside me, pushing off the railing to disappear back into the crowd. "Go on, then. The show is over, but the work is just starting." The dinner wound down an hour later, but the night wasn't finished. We rode the elevator up in silence, watching the numbers climb, but the air in the small metal box felt different now. It wasn't just heavy, it was waiting. We returned to the penthouse not as colleagues retreating to neutral corners, but as two variable stars caught in the same gravity well, preparing for the inevitable collision. The digital clock on the microwave read 2:14 a.m. The city outside had finally surrendered to the night, the frantic energy of the streets dissolving into a low, static hum of distant traffic. But inside the penthouse, the air was vibrating. We had abandoned the rigid formality of the dining table hours ago. Now, the Aura launch strategy was spread across the plush living room rug like a battlefield map, a chaotic sprawl of charts and documents. I was sitting cross-legged, surrounded by stacks of market analysis, while Emily lay on her stomach opposite me, propped up on her elbows, reading. The distance between us had evaporated. In the office, there was always a desk, a podium, or a glass wall. Here, there was only the carpet and the heavy, undeniable pull of gravity, dragging us toward the center of the room. My shoulder brushed against her arm as I leaned in to point at a discrepancy in the data projection. The contact was brief, a whisper of silk against cotton, but the heat of it lingered on my skin like a brand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her focus narrowing not on the paper, but on the space between our bodies. The exhaustion was stripping away her armor, revealing the woman beneath the executive title. "It's not enough," she murmured, her voice rough with fatigue. She dropped the report onto the pile, rubbing her temples. "The narrative is too clean. It feels—" She hesitated, searching for the word, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw the crack in the marble. Raw fear. If Aura doesn't land with weight, the board won't just kill the project. They'll dismantle the division. I built this architecture to hold the sky up, Clara. If it cracks, I'm underneath it. It was a confession delivered in the dark, an admission she would never have made in the daylight of the boardroom. I looked at the data spread between us. I saw what she was missing. She was trying to sell perfection, but the market wanted resilience. "You're selling the shield," I said quietly, pulling a graph from the bottom of the stack. "You need to sell the battle. Look at the beta retention rates. People don't use Aura because it's flawless, Emily. They use it because it learns from their mistakes. Pivot the pitch. It's not about being perfect. It's about being adaptive." Emily went still. She looked at the graph, then up at me. The cool, dissecting appraisal of the CEO was gone, replaced by something darker, warmer. She wasn't looking at an assistant anymore. She was looking at an equal. "Adaptive," she tested the word, tasting it. "Yes." She reached out. I thought she was reaching for the pen, but her fingers slid past the plastic barrel and wrapped around my wrist. Her skin was cool, her grip firm but not crushing. She wasn't taking the tool, she was checking the engine. Her thumb pressed against the inside of my wrist, right over the pulse point that was betraying me with its frantic, desperate rhythm. The room went silent. The air thickened, charged with a voltage that made the hair on my arms stand up. She held my gaze, her thumb tracing the beat of my heart, measuring the effect she had on me with cold, scientific precision. "You're racing," she whispered. It wasn't a question. "We're on a deadline," I managed to choke out, though we both knew the deadline had nothing to do with it. She held on for a second longer, a lifetime, before slowly releasing me. The ghost of her touch burned against my skin. "We have the angle," she said, sitting up, the mask sliding back into place, though it didn't fit quite as tightly as before. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sky was bruising into a deep, violent purple. The sun was coming. The night was over, but the line had been crossed, and there was no going back to the safety of the dark or the silence we had kept. The morning sun that flooded the convention center wasn't the dawn of a triumph. It was the harsh, unforgiving light of a catastrophe. At 8:15 a.m., 15 minutes before doors opened, the air in the green room curdled. A junior PR aide burst through the door, clutching a tablet like it was an unexploded ordnance. "Vertex just dropped a press release," he stammered. "They announced an AI core. It's the same feature set. They're undercutting the Aura launch." The room detonated. It was immediate chaos. The VP of marketing was shouting into a phone. Scriptwriters were frantically scrubbing pages. The carefully constructed narrative we had spent months building, and the last 48 hours bleeding over, was dead. If we walked out there with the original pitch, Sterling and Vance wouldn't look like innovators. We would look like we were chasing taillights. I looked for Emily. In a room swirling with panic, she was a statue of terrifying stillness. She stood before the lighted vanity mirror, her back to the screaming executives, staring at her own reflection. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't yelling. She was the eye of the hurricane, watching the debris of her strategy fly past her. She needed a weapon, and the arsenal she brought was suddenly obsolete. I stepped through the noise. "They're pitching speed," I said, my voice low but cutting through the frantic din. Emily turned. Her eyes were dark, searching. She didn't look at the VP. She looked at me. "Speed is cheap," I continued, stepping into the circle of her focus, blocking out the rest of the room. "Vertex is promising to be the fastest. We can't beat them on speed now. If we try, we look defensive." "So we don't try," Emily said, the realization sparking behind her eyes. The paralysis broke. She grabbed my arm, her grip tight, pulling me toward the portable server bank. The midnight edits, the adaptive learning angle. We pivot to precision. Where is the data on error correction? "I have it on the localized drive," I said, dropping to my knees to access the terminal. "I can swap the demo deck. We cut the velocity benchmarks. We replace them with accuracy case studies." "Do it," she commanded, leaning over me, her hand bracing on the server rack, boxing me in. You have 4 minutes. The next 240 seconds were a blur of synchronized adrenaline. We moved around each other in the cramped, wire-strewn backstage corridor with a fluidity that felt practiced. It was a dance of necessity. I handed her a tablet. She took it without looking, her fingers brushing mine, a transfer of data and intent. I stood up and she stepped back, our bodies passing within millimeters, avoiding collision but maintaining contact. I leaned over her shoulder to authorize a file transfer on the main console, my breath ghosting against the bare skin of her neck. She didn't flinch. She leaned into it, watching the progress bar like a lifeline. The scent of her, sandalwood and the sharp metallic tang of ozone, filled my lungs. The tension that had been simmering between us for days, the sexual heavy pull of the penthouse, transmuted instantly. It wasn't romance anymore. It was survival. We were 2 soldiers in a foxhole, stripping down the machinery of the launch to its barest, most lethal components while the shelling started outside. Every glance was a communication, every nod a confirmation. The team around us faded into the background. They were just noise. We were the signal. "Slide deck updated," I said. "The prompt is on the teleprompter. You're not selling a race car anymore, Emily. You're selling a scalpel." She stood up, smoothing her blazer. The raw fear I had seen in the penthouse was gone, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard resolve. She looked at me, and for a split second, the professional mask slipped completely. There was a fierce, wild gratitude in her eyes, a recognition that I hadn't just done my job. I had saved hers. "Wait here," she said. It wasn't an order to a subordinate. It was a request to a partner. "Watch this." The stage manager called go. The heavy velvet curtains parted. The roar of the crowd washed in, a physical wave of sound that vibrated in the floorboards. Emily stepped out into the blinding white light, walking toward the center mark with the stride of a woman who owned the ground she walked on. I stood in the wings, hidden in the shadows of the scaffolding, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wasn't just watching a CEO give a speech. I was watching the other half of the equation we had just solved. The crisis hadn't broken us. It had welded us together. The presentation was a triumph. Emily commanded the room, not with volume, but with the terrifying stillness of absolute certainty. She moved through the revised slides with a rhythm we had established in the dark, every statistic a beat, every transition a breath. When she reached the final pivot, the one we had engineered in the chaos of the backstage corridor, she paused. The silence in the auditorium was total. "Precision," she said, her voice amplified and clear, "is not about speed. It is about knowing exactly where to cut." She looked up then. She didn't look at the investors in the front row or the cameras flashing in the gallery. She looked past the blinding stage lights, directly into the wings where I stood in the shadows. It was a private acknowledgement broadcast to a room of 3,000 people. She wasn't finishing a pitch. She was closing a circuit. The applause that followed was a physical force, a wall of sound that vibrated against my ribs. But the adrenaline rush was already beginning to sour into exhaustion. The after-party was a blur of congratulations and heavy crystal glasses. I stood by Emily's side, playing the role of the dutiful analyst, but the air between us was too thin. Every handshake felt performative, every smile was a mask. We were ghosts in the machine, moving through a crowd that saw the success, but missed the survival. We didn't speak, but the frequency of our connection was deafening. We both felt the same urgent need to escape the noise, to strip away the public victory and examine the private wreckage. We retreated to the penthouse in silence. The elevator ride was an ascent into a vacuum. When the doors slid open, the suite was exactly as we had left it. Papers strewn across the rug, coffee cups half full. But the atmosphere had shifted. The frantic energy of the launch was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating quiet. It was the silence of the aftermath. We had survived the fire, but now we had to deal with the heat that was still radiating from our skin. Emily kicked off her heels near the door, the sound sharp in the stillness. She walked to the window, looking out at the city she had just conquered. I stood by the kitchen island, my hands gripping the marble edge, feeling the adrenaline crash leave me shaking. I should go, I said, the words tumbling out before I could check them. I should pack for the flight tomorrow. It was a lie. It was a retreat. I was trying to rebuild the walls we had demolished backstage. Emily turned. Her silhouette was framed by the city lights, dark and imposing. Is that what you want? She asked. Her voice was low, stripped of its boardroom armor. To pack? To go back to your desk and pretend we didn't just rewrite the code of this company together? I want to go home, I whispered, though I wasn't sure where that was anymore. You are home, she said. She crossed the room. It wasn't a walk. It was a collapse of distance. She moved with a predatory grace that made my breath catch in my throat. I took a step back, hitting the cold, floor-to-ceiling glass of the window. There was nowhere left to go. Emily didn't stop until she was inside my guard. She placed a hand on the glass beside my head, boxing me in. The city skyline was a dizzying drop behind me, but the danger was standing right in front of me. Her eyes were dark, dilated, searching my face with a hunger that had nothing to do with business. Stop running, she breathed. She didn't wait for permission. The permission had been signed in the sweat and panic of the green room. She closed the gap, her body pressed against mine, pinning me to the cool glass. The contrast was blinding. The cold window against my back, the searing heat of her front. Her hands tangled into my hair, gripping tight, pulling my head back to expose my throat. The kiss wasn't soft. It was a collision. It was a release of weeks of precision and restraint, a desperate, devouring pressure that shattered the last of my professional composure. Her mouth was hot, demanding, tasting of champagne and victory. I gasped, my hands finding purchase on the rough silk of her blouse, pulling her closer, trying to fuse our skeletons together. This wasn't the tentative touch of the plane ride. This was a claiming. She kissed me like she was signing a contract in blood, erasing the line between employer and employee with every bruise-heavy press of her lips. The adrenaline didn't crash. It burned, consuming the oxygen in the room until the only thing left was the terrifying, wonderful weight of her against me. The morning light hit the room like an interrogation lamp, bright and unforgiving, exposing every corner of the penthouse suite. Usually, the morning after a line is crossed, there is a hangover of regret, a frantic, silent scrambling to rebuild the walls that were knocked down in the dark. I expected the awkwardness to be waiting for me when I opened my eyes, a heavy, suffocating thing sitting at the foot of the bed. But it wasn't there. The sun cut through the sheer drapes, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and the only thing I felt was a strange, settled clarity. The panic of the launch was gone. The frantic, desperate heat of the night had cooled into something solid and undeniable. I walked out into the common area, my bare feet silent on the cold marble. Emily was already there, sitting at the limestone table where she had poured that first sharp drink. She wasn't wearing the armor of her suit yet. She was wrapped in a silk robe the color of midnight, reading a physical newspaper. It felt like a scene from a domestic life we hadn't earned yet, but one that fit us perfectly. She didn't jump when I entered. She didn't pull the lapels of her robe tighter to hide herself. She just looked up, and the air between us didn't crackle with tension anymore. It hummed with a steady, low-voltage current that felt permanent. We ate breakfast in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence of the car ride 3 days ago. That silence had been a vacuum, a space where oxygen went to die. This one was a bridge. There was no hierarchy at the table anymore, no CEO and assistant, just 2 people who had survived a war together and were quietly assessing the peace treaty. She didn't apologize. Emily wasn't a woman who offered apologies for things she meant to do, and she had meant every second of the night before. Instead, she pushed a plate of fruit toward me, a gesture of care that felt louder than a speech. The board sent a memo at 6, she said, her voice raspy with mourning, but clear. They liked the pivot. They want to know who authorized the strategy shift on the fly. She looked at me, her eyes steady over the rim of her coffee cup. I told them it was a joint decision. I told them I don't make moves without consulting my strategist. Strategist. Not analyst. Not assistant. With one word, she had rewritten my title in the eyes of the gods, without asking me, elevating me to the platform beside her. The journey back to the terminal felt less like an extraction and more like a victory lap. The black sedan was the same, the leather was the same, but the atmosphere inside had been terraformed. We boarded the jet under a clear blue sky. When we sat down, the dynamic of the cabin had shifted physically. On the way out, the table between us had been a barrier, a no man's land of negotiation. Now, it was a shared surface. I didn't pull out my laptop to hide. I didn't open a spreadsheet to avoid her gaze. We sat facing each other. The space between us collapsed. My knee brushed against hers as the plane taxied, and neither of us pulled away. The contact was casual, possessive, a constant reminder of the new protocol we had established. We were cruising at 30,000 feet when I decided to test the structural integrity of this new world. I watched the clouds drifting past the oval window, then turned back to her. She was reviewing the post-launch analytics, but I knew she was aware of every breath I took. So, I started, keeping my voice neutral, though my heart gave a traitorous little kick against my ribs. About my original request. Emily looked up, arching a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. The remote work request, I clarified, fighting a smile. Can I work remotely next week? It was the same question, word for word, that had started this cascade. But the context had been incinerated and rebuilt. Emily closed her folder slowly. She didn't give me the flat refusal she had delivered in her office. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, studying me with a look that was half amusement, half challenge. "You can try," she said, her voice dropping to that frequency that bypassed my ears and went straight to my spine. "But I think we both know the truth now, Clara. You don't want to be remote. You work better when you're close to the fire." She let her gaze drop to my lips, then back up to my eyes. "And I need the heat." The captain announced our descent before I could answer, though I didn't have one. She was right. The city rose up to meet us, the skyline gray and jagged, but it no longer looked like a fortress designed to keep me out. It looked like a landscape we had conquered. We weren't descending back into the grind. We were landing on ground we now owned, together. We walked through the lobby doors, the automatic glass sliding open to admit us back into the ecosystem we had escaped. The air conditioning hit us instantly, the familiar, sterile chill of the Sterling and Vance headquarters. But it felt different on my skin today. Before, this lobby had been a cathedral of intimidation, a space of high ceilings and echoing footsteps where I felt small, monitored, and expendable. Now, walking beside Emily, the marble floors didn't feel cold. They felt like a runway we had just cleared for landing. Our heels struck the stone in a synchronized rhythm. Click, 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 a dual heartbeat echoing through the cavernous space. We didn't touch. We didn't need to. The invisible tether that had been forged in the penthouse suite was pulled taut between us, vibrating with a frequency that only we could hear. Heads turned as we passed the reception desk. I saw the whispers starting, the curious, sidelong glances from the junior associates who wondered why the CEO was walking in step with a junior analyst, why the distance between our shoulders was measured in inches rather than authority. Emily didn't acknowledge them. She moved with that same lethal grace, head high, eyes forward, but there was a softness to the set of her jaw, a relaxation in her shoulders that hadn't been there a week ago. We reached the elevator bank, the parting point. The executive lift was waiting for her, the general staff elevators were for me. "I'll see you in the briefing at 2, she said. It sounded professional to anyone listening, a directive from a boss to a subordinate, but her eyes held mine for a beat too long, dark and promising, communicating a subtext that had nothing to do with quarterly projections. "At 2, I confirmed, my voice steady. She stepped into her elevator. The door slid shut, cutting off the view of her silhouette. But the pole didn't sever, it just stretched. I made my way to my desk, navigating the maze of cubicles that had once been my entire world. It looked smaller now, almost quaint, like a shell I had outgrown. I set my bag down, the leather creaking in the quiet hum of the open plan office. My monitors were dark, reflecting a version of myself that looked the same but felt fundamentally rewritten. I wasn't just the girl who ran the numbers anymore. I was the one who had seen the woman behind the curtain, seen the fear and the fire, and decided to stay there. I hadn't even logged in when my phone buzzed against the hard composite surface of the desk. The screen lit up, a single notification slicing through the mundane reality of the office. It was from her. Not an email, not a calendar invite sent by an assistant, a text. I picked it up, my thumb hovering over the glass, my pulse jumping in my throat. Dinner, my place, 8 p.m. 3 words. Simple, directive, and loaded with a terrifying amount of intimacy. This wasn't a request for overtime. It wasn't a strategy session disguised as a meal. It was an invitation to cross the final boundary, to step out of the neutral ground of hotels and business trips and into the reality of her private life. It was a negotiation where I had already conceded before sitting down at the table. The penthouse office she had demanded I stay in was no longer just a workspace. It was the prologue to this. I typed back, "I'll bring the wine. You bring the strategy." I hit send before I could overthink it, before the old fear of overstepping could paralyze my fingers. I looked up. Across the expanse of the floor, high up in her glass-walled sanctuary, Emily was standing by the window. She was looking down, watching me. Before this trip, I would have looked away. I would have pretended to be busy, buried my head in a spreadsheet, terrified of the weight of her attention. But today, I didn't flinch. I held her gaze through the layers of glass and corporate hierarchy. She saw me looking. The corner of her mouth ticked up, a smile so small, so private, it felt like a secret pressed into my palm. The dynamic had shifted permanently. The glass wasn't a barrier anymore. It was just a window. We weren't playing a game of cat and mouse. We were partners, balanced on the edge of something dangerous and absolutely necessary. The launch was over, but the real work, the work of us, was just beginning. The office is no longer a battleground of control for me. It has become a shared space of negotiated power, where the silence is no longer empty, but filled with a language only 2 people speak. We found the precision in the chaos. If this story resonated with the quiet, magnetic pull you feel towards the things you're supposed to avoid, subscribe for more. Tell me in the comments, what setting makes you feel most vulnerable?